The staggering array of new surveillance technologies threaten the basic right to privacy, a right recognized in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a right essential for democratic society. A key aspect of privacy in the digital age is control over our personal information. The threat to that privacy is that new technologies enable the mass, automated, and almost invisible collection of personal data, which is then used to track, analyze, and predict human behavior. The new technologies are transforming surveillance from isolated, purposeful monitoring into a pervasive, real-time tracking of everyday life. Today, we're looking at one that has received little public attention, but raises serious privacy issues, and that is eye tracking. Eye tracking data has the possibility of providing surprising information about us, not only gender, age, and ethnicity, but also personality traits, drug consumption habits, emotional state, skills and abilities, fears, interests, sexual preferences, and physical and mental health conditions. I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion. Before I introduce our impressive panel of experts on eye tracking, I want to acknowledge that the land in which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Natalia Menendez Gonzalez. Natalia is a research associate in data governance at the Center for Digital Society at the European University Institute, and assistant professor and director of the minor in digital law and AI law at CUNEF University in Spain. And Natalia is speaking to us from Europe tonight. So welcome, Natalia, and thank you for doing this very late at night for you.
Thank you, Jim, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our second panelist is Jennifer Ryan. Jennifer is the Anne and Max Tanenbaum Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Senior Scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education, and she is professor in the Department of Psychology and in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And our moderator is Evan Light. Evan is Associate Professor of Policy Studies in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, where he runs the Policy Dreams Gallery and Lab. His research centers on democratizing technology and policy for positive social change. Evan is also a Senior Fellow at the Center for Free Expression. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
And I'd like to welcome the audience. The format for tonight's panel is the panel is going to have a conversation about eye tracking and a number of aspects of it, and then we're going to open the conversation and bring the audience into it. In this version of Zoom that we're using, the chat does not function, but there is, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a small tab that says Q&A. And so what we encourage the audience is you're listening to Natalia and Jen and Evan have their conversation. If questions come up, either things you'd like them to elaborate or things that you want to question or things you want to raise, just click on that Q&A button and write down your question. And when the panel turns to the audience after 45 to 60 minutes, Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the center, will be asked by Evan to read out the first question, which she will do. The panel will discuss it, then go on to the second question. But it's really most helpful if, as you have questions, you simply write them down at the time rather than waiting till when we turn to the audience. I think that's all for me, so I'll turn it over to the three of you.
Thanks, Jim. So Natalia and Jen, you both come from different backgrounds and have different interests and expertise in eye tracking. I'm wondering if you can, I guess, collectively weigh in on what is eye tracking as a technology to begin with.
Great. Well, I can start from the researcher perspective. Eye tracking is a tool that allows us to do what it says, track where your eyes are moving in space. So in the lab, this is done with a series of high-speed cameras and an infrared light. So an infrared light will shine into your eye and reflect off of your pupil and your corneal reflection, and it will allow you to then see how, when you're moving your eyes, how the angle of those reflections changes between the pupil and the cornea. And so at the beginning of eye tracking procedures, you can do a calibration. So that allows you to determine if you set out different points on a screen and you ask people to look at those points in turn. And that will then allow you to record where those pupil and corneal reflections, the angles between them, are at each of those points. And that allows you to then use those points to interpolate where the person is viewing anywhere on the screen. And so that's in the lab. And then you can also do eye tracking with phones and tablets and VR headsets out in the rest of the world. And the logic is really the same there too. So eye tracking in those setups are also using a series of cameras, but they may not be as high speed of camera. And you look at landmarks on the face, you look at where the features are. And again, you do a calibration procedure that asks you to look at different points on the screen. And then from those landmarks and those spatial relationships, you can then interpolate where someone is looking at any given time. So the accuracy in when you're looking at VR headsets or webcams or phones might not be exactly the same as in lab or research, but they're pretty good, and so you can use them to explore all kinds of questions. And so for me, I do research on memory function, which I can get into later. So I use eye tracking to tell me about how people think and what they remember.
Thanks. And Natalia, why would we want to do eye tracking?
I mean, I think Jen also explained it perfectly. So maybe to give a little bit of context, it would be interesting to say how I became familiar or acquainted with eye tracking, in the sense that I'm a legal researcher, as Jim mentioned at the beginning, and I'm especially interested about biometric technologies. I did my PhD on facial recognition, so that was the technology I was most familiar and most interested about. But then I was involved in a project where actually I had to assess the compatibility of eye tracking technologies, and more specifically, Jen mentioned the use of eye tracking for VR and AR headsets, the MetaQuest Pro, with the European Union's data protection legislation. So actually, I did not have any idea before that this kind of technology was used in this kind of devices. I discovered it. I started doing research on the topic, and actually having a legal background and also having a special interest on biometric technologies, but also privacy and data protection. The next question after knowing a little bit what was happening was precisely, okay, but maybe this from the privacy data protection perspective presents or might present some kind of problem. So that was my first impression or my first connection with the topic.
What was it about eye tracking that piqued your interest in terms of privacy? It sounds like you sort of instinctually saw something happening there that you thought was problematic.
I mean, first of all, the fact that I think there's something kind of intuitive for everybody, and it's something that it's pervasive to all biometric technologies, which is that the fact that there are some technologies that from certain, I would say, bodily features are able to decipher or identify or give information as sensitive as your identity in some cases, but also we will discuss it later, but the kinds of data that you can obtain from this kind of technologies from a privacy and data protection perspective is really interesting, maybe in the wrong sense. Also because, as I said before, in some cases it might be more straightforward, but in other cases it's surprising the kind of data that can be inferred or that can be extracted from these devices, but particularly the nature of those data, because some of these, Jim mentioned some at the beginning, some of these data are really, they really belong to the most intimate and private sphere, I would say, of any subject.
Jen, I'm wondering, with your background in neuroscience, if you can tell us a bit more about the data that one gets from eye tracking and what this sort of data can reveal about an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can get a lot of information about a person's cognitive health, and we can infer a lot about their brain health and also their mental health from their eye movements. So, we can pick up all kinds of measures about where people are looking, how long they are looking, and what they transition to when they're looking out at different items in space. But those patterns of how you're moving your eyes around the world can actually distinguish a child from a younger adult and a younger adult from an older adult. And then you can have other patterns of eye movements that could distinguish someone who maybe is having difficulty reading, so they may have dyslexia, from someone who doesn't have dyslexia, just by how they are reading the text in front of them. You can also have different patterns of eye movements for people who might have difficulty with memory or with difficulty in attention or executive function. So in such cases, you might not be able to not look at information that's distracting out in your visual world. Or you might not show patterns of eye movements that suggest you remember someone or not. So there's lots of information about how we think and how we learn that can be expressed through different patterns of eye movements. And there are eye movement patterns that really track with people's brain health. So there are certain eye movement patterns that tend to correlate with the structure and function of different brain areas. So you can actually use eye movements to give you an idea of how healthy someone's brain is. So you could use eye movements to tell you if someone is falling into a neurodegenerative condition, for instance. So there's a lot of good that eye tracking can do, but in terms of the health space, but there's also just so much information that you're giving away for free about how old you are, whether you are male or female, what you're interested in, how you're thinking, if you're having any problems in the way that you're thinking, and also if you're having any mental health concerns. So people with depression might look at the world a little bit differently than people who don't have depression. And all of that we can just get by looking at where you're looking, how long, and exploring those patterns.
I have a question for both of you. In what sorts of settings would we encounter these technologies? I mean, it sounds like they can be really useful in controlled settings for medical diagnoses, but we're also, you mentioned Natalia, you mentioned that we see these eye tracking capabilities in webcams, in VR and AR headsets. Where out in the wild does one encounter these things, and what sort of data is revealed in those situations?
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in, I think also the questions is where can we find these technologies now, but also in the future. So for instance, I was reading, I would say 1 year ago, more or less, an article about the use of eye tracking in neuromarketing. To my knowledge, this is not a very extended practice, at least in the European Union, but to be honest, and we have seen this happening with other technologies, maybe not now, but maybe in a couple of years, this will be actually something that would be more something we will deal with it every day. And also, as it happened with other technologies, such as artificial intelligence, for instance, I would say maybe there might be a risk of commodification of these technologies in the sense of incorporating them in technologies, in some cases, maybe because they are needed or because they can improve the service, but also in other cases because they can offer cool services or more futuristic ways or seamlessly ways of providing, for instance, enrollment or other kinds of services.
For the budget audience, can you describe in some detail what you mean by neuromarketing?
Yeah, so for instance, in this article, they were referring about the use of data that came from eye tracking systems for different purposes. First of all, there was the potential possibility of manipulating the behavior of the users in the sense that they could end up buying or being attracted at least to a product that maybe they won't be attracted anyways. Also, in order to monitor where they were putting their attention or where they paying attention to, which also might end up having an impact on where to place, for instance, an advertisement. So I think there might be different ways, but in the end, it was mostly directed at the use of eye tracking information to advertise and also in some way try to nudge consumer habits.
So I know you both have some concerns about eye tracking in terms of privacy. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Maybe starting with Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are great ways in which eye tracking, I think, will be helpful for diagnostics in the future. But right now we're seeing, and I should back up, but we're also seeing eye tracking being used as an accessibility feature, so which is fantastic, right? So being able to use our phones and our tablets and our computers with our eyes rather than with our hands or with our voices. So that's really wonderful for people who need those accessibility features. It allows them much more control and independence. And we also see those accessibility features exist within the gaming sphere as well, which is, again, fantastic, allows people to fully participate. But as eye tracking then becomes more common in each of these devices, and really becomes much more common in the gaming spaces through VR headsets and so on, I think there is a concern that in those environments in which we're now just accepting eye tracking as part of the user experience, part of the way in which we are engaging with visual content, and it allows that content to be displayed much more clearly and smoothly. I think there is a concern that we'll just accept the use of eye tracking in these spaces without really thinking or even knowing that we are giving away some of our personal health information, that we might be giving away information about how we're thinking or whether we have any problems with our thinking, or if we're giving away information about our mental health in these gaming environments or online environments in general. So I see that there's certainly an emerging trend to have eye tracking embedded in all of our devices, and for lots of fantastic reasons. But again, I think as those become more acceptable to us, or we see them more often, then I think we really have to be concerned about where our health information is going and how it is being used.
Yeah, from my perspective, as I said before, it's particularly about the kind of data that can be, again, extracted or that can be obtained from using these devices. So as Jim mentioned at the beginning, I have a background in European Union law. And in the European Union, we have this regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, when we basically distinguish between three kinds of data. So non-personal data which is not related with any identifiable subject, such as, I don't know, stock information or weather forecasts. Then we have personal data, which relates to an identified or identifiable individual. And then inside, let's say, personal data, we have another category, which is called special categories of personal data or sensitive data, which is data which is personal, of course, but it's, as its name says, sensitive. So even more delicate or even more private than already private data. And these are, for instance, biometric data for the purpose of identifying a person, data which has to do with political ideology, data which concerns sexual orientation, data which concerns race, so on and so forth. Actually, I would say most or all of these categories are examples of data that actually can be extracted or obtained via eye tracking. So for me, the fact that it's not any kind of data is particularly, again, if we think about sexual orientation, it's something that it's very, very intimate of one person's, and it belongs to their private sphere, or at least it should belong if they do not want to disclose it. The fact that it's possible to infer this kind of information, it's what, for me, makes eye tracking potentially very dangerous.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there, that it's, I think where the tricky part with respect to privacy concerns comes from is that there's nothing in, say, the physics of how the eyes move themselves, of the force of the eyeball, or the length of an eye movement, or so on, as you're making saccades, or the particular nature about generating gaze fixations to land on a particular area. So there's nothing about the physics of the eye movements that necessarily distinguish older people from younger people, or distinguish people of different races, or distinguish different sexes. So that's where it can look like you're not actually transmitting very sensitive information, but actually, if you're devising the visual world in a particular way, and you're asking people to engage with visual content in front of them, and you structure the environment such that now you can pick up, do I like looking over here, or do I like looking over here, or do I know this person, or do I know that person, or so on. Then you can start to, or can you have complicated games that you're asking people to navigate through while you're eye tracking. Now you can start to pull apart patterns just from the basic eye gaze data that tells you, now this is a child, now this is an older adult, this is likely to be a man, this is likely to be a woman. And I think that's where there can be this really disconnect, because again, the physics don't change amongst people for how the eyeball moves, but the way in which we might explore our environments based on the information that's presented to us can really change based on all of those demographics and be very identifying.
So if I believe that I control my eyes and my brain, is there anything that I, as a human being, can do to not reveal any of this in situations where I might be exposed to eye tracking? Like if I'm playing a video game with an AR headset or a VR headset, can I consciously defeat what might be in the apparatus that I'm engaging with?
Not really. I mean, you can change the game a little bit, but there are still ways to pick out these things. So your eyes move so fast, and most of the time we don't even realize what we're looking at when we're looking at things. We don't even realize that we moved our eyes in certain ways. And we've certainly seen studies where the viewer is asked, like, don't let me know which person in this lineup, or you've seen before in this lineup, or don't try to move your eyes in a particular pattern that doesn't let me know that you have memory here in this situation. And even in such cases where people are trying to game the system or trying to prevent that knowledge from being exposed through their eye movements, it doesn't necessarily work. We can still pick out particular very rapid details that will reveal what you know.
And I'm curious, is there any way that the technology itself can be built in such a way that is privacy protective, that eliminates the ability, for instance, of gaming companies to determine my gender or my um, sexual orientation through my eye movements?
Mhm. I defer to Natalia on this one. I know that there are a number of privacy policies that will say, you know, we're not going to record your face, or the recordings of your face or the recordings of your eye will not be on our servers. So that obviously certainly helps. But if there are retaining some amount of gaze data, just the simple data points about where are you looking on the images in front of you or on the world in front of you, then I think that could be very problematic. But I don't know in what ways people are already guarding against this. So I defer to Natalia on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, from the designing point of view, I think there are some choices actually that developers or designers can do, or in some cases, they can choose to do. Like, for instance, eye tracking can be image based, or there can be other different ways to perform eye tracking. In principle, when you do it image based and you need the image of an eye and sometimes even the skin that it's surrounding, let's say, the eye, which for instance reveals skin color, which for instance, according to European Union legislation, is considered a proxy for race, which is a piece of sensitive data, and it can be also a proxy for certain health conditions. So if you choose, for instance, not to use image-based eye tracking, in principle, it could be one way where you are, through the designing of the technology, opting for a more privacy-friendly, let's say, choice. And then, as Jen mentioned, there is the privacy policies or the ways that you use eye tracking technology, or also inside the privacy policies, the freedom that you leave to the consumer, to the user, to choose exactly which data is used for which purposes, how to opt out, how not to do it. So actually there are ways, or there are things that can be done.
How pervasive is eye tracking technology? Is it something that can be encountered, for instance, through CCTV, which is widespread through the countries that we live in? Or is it really just something that's isolated in higher technology systems? Or for instance, if I were to analyze a CCTV recording of somebody, would I be able to perform eye tracking on a recording of their face?
That's a great question. So, you know, eye tracking, certainly in our newer models of phones and laptops and webcams and tablets, you can, simply from recordings of people's faces, you could certainly get information about directions that that a person is looking at. How depending on the camera angles and the number of cameras and how much you can triangulate that, you may be able to pinpoint, or within reason, what people are looking at. Natalia, do you have better sense of their capabilities right now?
Yeah, no, more or less what you said. And I think also it depends on the kind of data that you want to obtain. Like, for instance, if it's about gaze direction, I feel that from a recording from a CCTV, it could be possible. If we are talking about other kinds of data, maybe it would be also something that it can be considered is in these cases, quality of the image is crucial. And this is also a choice that developers in some cases can try to use. Like, for instance, if a picture of the eye with low quality in certain areas but high quality in other areas is enough for obtaining the data that you need to obtain, this is also a choice that you might want to make.
So in part is the quality of the image in the camera. We have, for instance, Amazon Ring doorbell cameras that now work in to in 4K in pretty high resolution. Um, how do we control this technology
That's the
as
key.
citizens of countries that have privacy regulators, but also governments that intervene in the development of technologies, um, given the privacy concerns that you've very well illustrated? How do we deal with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because on the one hand, the technology can do so much good, right? So in terms of health diagnostics, or in terms of accessibility, in terms of participation in society. So there, you don't really want to block that, but you want to put some restrictions around how the data might be used, either by the party that's collecting it or by third parties that may be attached to it.
Yeah, something that I always say, not only with regards to eye tracking, but with regards to any technology, is that technology per se is not good or bad, dangerous or harmless, or wherever you want to call it. Is the use that we humans make of it, the one or the thing that makes it actually dangerous, or a threat, or wherever. So actually, first of all, as I said before, there are design choices, but then there is also the issue of regulation. And here I think it's also important to highlight the thing that Jim said at the beginning, that this technology has been, I think, a little bit under the radar. So there is no, for instance, a lot of public awareness, at least in my opinion, about the existence or the use of this technology at a general mainstream level. I would say, for instance, facial recognition is much well recognized. Let's say, and I think this is, first of all, this is a key aspect. Citizens, NGOs, civil society cannot make anything about these technologies if they do not know that they exist. And then, in principle, as you, Evan, said, if we have privacy and data protection regulations, as long as we are talking here about the processing of different data, we should be protected. But in practice, in reality, it's not always like that. So that's also the reason why in some, for instance, at the European Union level, there are some voices talking about having an eye tracking specific regulation. But it's true that at the beginning, the regulation has proven not to be enough.
It feels like we have a window of opportunity potentially, because the technology isn't pervasive yet, and we understand its potentials. I'm wondering, it's I think often when we discuss the regulation of what you could call dual purpose or multi-purpose technologies that can be used for surveillance in privacy invasive ways, but also useful, for instance, in healthcare. The idea of policing them falls into, okay, how do we police the development of technology without becoming the surveillance state that we're being critical of? And so I'm wondering, what do you see as potential innovative ways to approach an apparatus like eye tracking? How do we get at this thing that has good and harmful uses that are hard to separate in the technology itself, and maybe in practical application of regulation?
I think, yeah, I would say just at the very least, a first step is making people aware of the kinds of information that can be revealed through their eye movement. So you're putting that power of choice then into the consumer's hands around whether they would like to engage with this kind of technology and under what conditions. Natalia.
Yeah, I was also, when you mentioned this point, Jennifer, thinking, for instance, about this example, about this WorldCoin, this kind of cryptocurrency that OpenAI tried to make widespread. And the way they did it actually, or the way you had access or you gain access, at least at the beginning, to this kind of cryptocurrency was basically going before a tool called an orb, which was basically like a ball, where they actually gather data about your iris, if I was not mistaken. And in principle, people all over the world, because this was at least that I know in Portugal, in Spain, but I know also in other countries outside of the European Union, a lot of people were doing it first because you gain, I don't remember how many, but some of these cryptocurrencies, first of all, so free cryptocurrencies, but also because it's super cool and super futuristic. So it's also very important, as you said, to raise awareness that yes, this is true, but also what are you giving up in order to, in this case, have access to this. And also just to think about the fact that eye tracking, as we said before, maybe, and you said it very rightly, Evan, it's not pervasive, or seems not to be pervasive, but we don't know what might happen in the future. So if we think also from a legal perspective, in a future-proofing way, I love this because it gives me the chance to talk about my PhD thesis. In law, we have this principle called the principle of proportionality, which says that when a government, but it's also valid, for instance, for the deployment of a technology, wants to impose a measurement, or in this case, the use of a technology, it should look to three circumstances. So the technology should be suitable, so it should be fit for the purpose. It should be necessary, so from all the potential suitable technologies or measures should be the less restrictive one. And also there should be some kind of balancing interest, which I think it's the key here. Balancing between, okay, these technologies might have a lot of potential, for instance, when it has to do with health innovation, but maybe they are not necessary for, I don't know, playing VR games and have a super cool and super futuristic experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's going to be the tricky part, because I think that's where we're going to see eye tracking being used quite a bit more within gaming environments. And there's certainly technology advantages to that. So by having eye tracking within, say, a VR headset in a gaming environment, you can do what's called foveated rendering. So it mimics human vision, where you can, wherever you're looking at, where your fovea is placed on, you have really clear images. But outside of that, in your peripheral, what would be in your peripheral vision, now you can downgrade the quality of the image that's being projected through the VR headset. So you can reduce the computational power or in providing those images to the viewer, to the gamer. And so that's helpful from the company side, right? To have this really smooth experience. And there are also ways in which you can use eye tracking to present the world to the viewer that reduces the motion sickness that you would often get from, and the vertigo that you would get from being in a VR headset. So there are ways in which eye tracking is being used to improve the gaming experience for everyone on both sides, so you can have a better quality experience. And then also there are ways in which eye tracking is being used to create new modes of storytelling, which is also really exciting. So I'm thinking in particular of the game Before Your Eyes, which would present a narrative to you until you blinked. And if you blinked, then that narrative would stop and it would jump to the next scene, and the narrative unfolds. So you get this really interesting tension then in the game where you don't want to blink, you want to see the game unfold, the narrative unfold, but of course you have to blink, so then it jumps forward. But that's just by using eye tracking, then you're evoking a new way of telling a story or having the user experience the story. And I think we'll see more and more of that come out, where the gameplay changes based on what you're looking, or if you're blinking, or how long you're looking at something. So given the technology improvements, the improvements in, in the user experience, and then the improvements in storytelling, or at least the new creative ways you can use storytelling, I think we're going to see more of an explosion of eye tracking within gaming spaces that is going to rise a lot faster than perhaps our ability to constrain it with policy. So I think the timing is really right for that.
Yeah, maybe also if I can add something to this first, that I completely agree. I mean, this is not unique to eye tracking, but it's true that lately in the last years, the paradigmatic example, I think in this case, was artificial intelligence, but regulation is really struggling to keep up with innovation in general. And I don't think this will be, eye tracking will be an exception. And then about the point of video games, something that I would like also to emphasize is that I see as problematic. Sorry to be this negative, but we lawyers, we like to cause trouble and to ask the difficult questions and to create problems. So this is my role here also, I think. But something that I find really problematic is that usually the target, let's say, of video games includes children and teenagers. And then this would also, and young adults, this would leave us to another debate, which is the responsibility of parents and whether they should check, for instance, before buying a headset, the different specifications. But it's also true that the policies of these devices are not often super clear, but I would leave that for a different debate, but it should be also considered. I think that in many cases, children and teenagers or young adults are the ones, when it comes to, not only, but when it comes to video games, the ones that are going to be exposed to eye tracking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm wondering how accurate is eye tracking in terms of discerning race and gender? And I'm curious in part because of experience of a former doctoral student of mine, now a collaborator at NYU, who in part of his doctoral work was looking at how commonly used facial recognition systems determine if your eyes are closed. He developed an online game that you can only play with your eyes closed. It was a reaction, ironically enough, to Zoom at the time that we spent on Zoom during the pandemic. And so he created this game where multiple people could connect to a website that would recognize them, but only when their eyes were closed. And when they moved their head, it would generate harmonic tones. And so you could make music with other people who you could not see only when your eyes were closed. And when he started to dig into it, he realized that it only recognized essentially white male eyes. And he had to create a different way to calibrate a webcam to understand the dynamics of an eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think first, as the camera technology continues to increase, then you will be able to detect eye movements better and blinks better, rather than just really sort of inferring where you are looking by sort of the landmark of face features and so on. But to your point about whether you can detect gender or you can detect race, and I think it requires constructing the environment in a particular way. So thinking in particular about a study I saw recently that showed that young girls with anxiety may tend to look at social media indicators of social status, how many likes someone has, how many follows someone has. And so there are things that may play to one gender or another gender, or may play to whether someone is struggling with their mental health or not. So again, it's not necessarily the mechanics of the eye movements, but what we're asking people to look at and constructing that world in a particular way that may allow us to pull out a reasonable guess of someone's gender or someone's race.
And then I guess my potentially my last question before we move to Q&A. I'm wondering so in the world of facial recognition, which has been around for quite a while, and there have been a number of people who have developed different tactics to counteract it. We saw it in Hong Kong during protests where people experimented with face paint and hairdos, with receptive clothing. There have been whole clothing lines put out based on counteracting facial recognition. Thinking of a designer, I think in the US, who put together a sort of clothing with parts of fake license plates. There are a couple, there's one, I think it originated with an optometrist in Chicago who has a line of eyewear called reflecticles that reflect infrared beams back at infrared cameras to essentially blind them and make facial recognition impossible. Are there any similar or different tactics that you know of to actively resist eye tracking, or are we always walking around broadcasting personally identifiable health information out of our eyes, but with no ability to control it?
I personally don't know ways to circumvent it, but those infrared blocking lenses would certainly help, I would imagine. But I haven't come across ways to necessarily circumvent. Natalia, have you seen anything or can think of something?
No, me neither. Maybe the closest that I can think about it's going through the privacy settings of, I mean, if that's a possibility, because in some cases it won't be, but going through the privacy settings of the device in question, try to be as, I mean, also depending on what information you want to give or not to give, and try to be as restrictive as one wants.
So, and perhaps we can move to the Q&A if the audience has any questions they would like to bring up and add to the conversation.
Yeah, we got quite a few questions actually. So the first question from an attendee, they ask what entities or actors, both legitimate and illegitimate, are using this technology now? How widespread is this usage?
Well, I will say that all of the major technology companies, if they don't already have eye tracking embedded in some of the devices that they provide, I think they will in the future. So all of the major technology companies that you can think of have either filed patents to produce eye tracking within the systems, such as VR headsets or through webcams as they're scrolling through apps or so on, or they've acquired smaller startup eye tracking companies to allow to do, say, smart glasses or to embed eye tracking in AR or VR headsets. So there are many legitimate actors really that have eye tracking either already as part of an accessibility feature or part of a gaming feature, or there are more uses coming.
Maybe if I can also jump in on this, I think it's a very interesting question in the sense that for me also part of the question, let's say, is about exactly the actors who have access to this information. Like, for instance, as we said before, doctors, in principle, no problem. Big tech companies, depends. Also, because I think Jennifer mentioned this at the beginning, the potential third-party sharing data policies that these companies might have. And then about the legitimate or illegitimate access, I think this is also a crucial question in the sense that even if access is legitimate, for instance, because we have provided our consent, if the consent was not properly informed, if the consent was in a way conditioned by dark pattern practices and so on, even if, let's say, by the book, the legitimate processing of the processing of the data is legitimate, I would question the fact that certain actors have access to this data.
And to also add in, I think it follows a trend of increasingly stockpiling biometric information that's irrevocable. information that doesn't change, that is your identity forever, essentially. And so the more this information is collected and made available, the higher risk there is that it can be obtained by illegitimate actors and used for purposes that it's not being collected for. And can I have the next question?
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, how do we bridge the benefits of eye tracking as a potential biomarker for brain health with the privacy concerns that collecting this type of data might bring? For example, many people are already happy that their smartwatch warns them about heart concerns.
Yeah, I think that's the trick, right? And it goes back to who is providing the technology, what they're telling you they are using it for, if they're storing that data and for what purposes, and who else has access to that data. So ideally, if we're doing this for health diagnostic purposes, then that data is personal to you, is not necessarily stored in places where lots of other actors have access to it. It's stored within hospital systems, and is shared only with your immediate care team. And again, I think that's where the understanding of the governance and of the data and what you are consenting to becomes really important.
Do you want to add anything, Natalia?
No, as I said before, proportionality principle, I would say suitability, necessity, and balancing. But then also, at the end of the day, to be honest, not to be patronizing if people really, for instance, in the case of the smartwatch, maybe rather than eye tracking, if they are really understanding what kind of data they are allowing to process for which purposes to which actors and so on, and they consent happily. For me, it should be also, I mean, it's completely okay.
And can I have the next question?
Yeah, the next question is from Alan, and Alan says, can the current AI-powered smart glasses perform eye tracking in a conversation with someone, providing immediate heads-up feedback in the conversation?
I'm not sure I understand the last part, but there are smart glasses that will allow you to do some eye tracking while you are having a conversation with someone or navigating around the world. And in such cases, you could have cameras in both directions. So a camera that is tracking your eye movement, so it's aimed at your eye, but also another camera that is seeing what you are seeing for the purposes of then overlaying your eye movements onto that world, so that you can as a researcher, so then I can understand what it was that you were looking at, what you were attending to when you were making particular decisions. So if you are wearing some smart glasses when having a conversation with that kind of setup, then yes, that you would be recording not only your eye movements, but that person that you're talking to as well as the broader environment within the range of those glasses.
But would you be able to, for instance, track the eye movements of the person that you're interacting with?
Oh, yes, then yeah, it's depending on how good the resolution is of the camera that is capturing them as well. You could make some inferences again about gaze direction. Certainly, you might not be able to pinpoint with accuracy what specifically you're looking at. So like Evan, if I'm talking to you and you have smart glasses on, you're recording me talking to you, you might not know which of your books I'm looking at in the background, but you might be able to detect like, oh, I'm looking over that shoulder where your books are. So I think you could certainly do some course analysis of where and what direction you're looking at, but perhaps not exactly pin down what behind you might be looking at.
And can we get the next question?
Yeah, actually, I have a quick follow-up question for Jennifer to the first question that was asked. And somebody asked, does that mean our webcams may be being used to record our eye tracking?
Not necessarily, not unless you, I think, like, not unless you are engaging with a program that would require it. But webcams do have the capability, when connected to other types of software platforms, to then do eye tracking through the webcam itself. But it's not necessarily monitoring, from what I understand about webcams anyway, and Evan and Natalia can jump in and correct me here. But say, like, we're on Zoom right now. Zoom is not necessarily monitoring our eye movements as we're doing this. You would need another interface to run that kind of data collection.
I remember a couple of years ago, maybe 2023, 2022, Zoom changed their terms of service and suddenly said that its users were going to be providing biometrics for them to train AI. And there was a huge immediate backlash, and they very quickly reverted back to their previous terms of service. So I think that the potential is there for collecting biometrics through webcams. And it's an interesting example of how people mobilize pretty quickly to get a large commercial entity to change course.
Right. But I think that changing course is a lot trickier when, say, you're in a gaming environment and you want your avatar to look like you, and to look where you're looking, and to smile when you're smiling, and to move when you're moving, right? So that can be tricky.
Yeah, I guess it's a trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely a trade-off. And like Natalia said, if you're fine with that trade-off, then that's fantastic. But it's about being sure that everyone knows what kind of trade-off they're making.
Ange, do you want to ask me the question?
Yeah, the next question from an attendee. Somebody asks, what role do you foresee for scientists working in this field more broadly, for example, vision science and marketing, in explaining to legislators what can and can't be interpreted from eye tracking technology?
Yeah, I think that's really key. So much in the same way that scientists had to explain that you couldn't necessarily use MRIs in a court of law, or there were quite a few limitations to that. I think we as scientists have a responsibility to talk to policymakers and to talk with technology companies as well about having a shared understanding of what kinds of information you can grab from eye tracking and what you can't. And the science is certainly improving in that the field really is trying to explore whether you can get individuating signatures of who someone is based on their eye movements. So, and what kinds of data you need in order to identify, like, oh, this is Evan's eye movements versus this is Natalia's eye movements. So I think as we continue to explore the science, both in terms of biometrics and in terms of health diagnostics, I think it's really critical that we keep up that conversation with everyone so that everyone's on the same page. And this is certainly, how the three of us got to start talking, because, in my research lab, we're using eye tracking as a tool to tell us about someone's brain health. But of course, as we're moving along that line to ascertain whether on an individual person by person basis, I can say, hey, your memory is great, or your memory is not doing so great, you might want to follow up. And then it started to click, like, oh, there's this real concern about privacy then if you're giving away your eye tracking data in other spaces. And so there's great benefits to it, but also some real concerns and some trade-offs that we need to be aware of. So I think as scientists, we do have responsibilities to have these broader conversations.
But also, to be fair, I think regulators also have a responsibility to, as you said, keep up or be on the same page. because just to mention one example, it had to do not exactly with eye tracking, but with virtual reality and the metaverse. I was like, I think 3 or 4 years ago in an event about the metaverse, and there was somebody from the European Commission who was in charge of metaverse policy, presenting a little bit what was the, let's say, the vision of the Commission with regard to this. And then at some point during the Q&A, somebody asked this person a question or something like, yeah, but what was your personal experience with virtual reality, or have you tried, or I don't remember exactly. And this person said, no, I've never tried virtual reality. For me, this is, I mean, I'm not saying that in order to regulate eye tracking, regulators should be subject to eye tracking, but to me, sometimes regulators should be more aware of what's out there, how it's being used, and what are the potential risks, which is not something that I would say they do 100% of the time, at least at the European Union level.
And I think that goes back to Evan's point, right? If you have regulators try eye tracking, then they get a sense of how much can really control their eye movements, or how much can we as scientists still tell about how they're thinking or they're feeling, even if they're trying to disguise that from us. And so to get that experience, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, I think different jurisdictions have different challenges. Europe is much more proactive in doing this sort of work, but also has much more power. In Canada, our privacy regulators are fairly disempowered. Our federal regulator does not have the power to fine anybody or really order anybody to actually do anything. They can make recommendations. And they've been asking for judicial authority for years. Our privacy regulations in Canada are around 20 years out of date. And so it's impossible for our actual laws that we have today to provide real tools for government to work with. So I think even if our regulators are interested in this space and do the research, that they aren't necessarily empowered to regulate it. And so it's even more important for people like Jennifer and I in Canada to go to members of parliament, for instance, and say, hey, this is something you need to be aware of and take seriously. But I'm also a big fan of experiential education. And I really look forward to being able to bring technology to parliamentary committees and say, hey, experience eye tracking or facial recognition as you're making laws around it, so that you actually understand what's at stake and how you feel about it, rather than leaving it to, say, parliamentary researchers or the privacy regulators to do research and explain theoretically what the situation is that they need to regulate. And are there more questions from the audience?
Yep. The next question, well, Sananda makes a comment and would like the panelists to comment on whoever is pulling patterns from eye tracking data, then that is eugenics. The problem then is the same, the tech or the human design of the tech. Is that so?
There is a very interesting article, which I think it's called Physiognomic AI, because basically it's about artificial intelligence, but basically it makes the point that what it's called categorization AI system, or for instance, in the case of facial recognition, what is called as face analysis, is the modern eugenics, or the modern physiognomic practices, in the sense that we are using this technology to go as far, in the case of facial recognition, to predict political ideology, sexual orientation, and many other questions. And also there is the whole backlash against this kind of research, basically based on the lack of scientific evidence supporting this kind of application. So I would say 100% agree. That's another potential problem that we might face, maybe a little bit out of privacy and data protection. And then we also have the question of whether or when decisions are taken based on this kind of outputs. So for instance, again, in the case of artificial intelligence, for instance, when it was used to predict recidivism scores, based on, among other factors, race, the shape of your face, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Linda. Is there another question, Ange?
Yeah, the next question is for both Jennifer and Natalia. I'm curious from your two unique perspectives, what is one misconception about eye tracking technology that you wish the public better understood right now?
Natalia, do you want to go first?
I really don't, but no, I will try. It's a very good one. I mean, again, maybe I'm a little bit repetitive, but I would say eye tracking is a useful technology, potentially lots of good uses of it, but maybe not see it as a cool thing. It's true that from a, I would say, sci-fi point of view, it could be very cool that just from your eyes, all this kind of data can be extracted, but I wouldn't frame it as cool or futuristic, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't know if I would necessarily say that there's a lot of misconceptions, but it's just not necessarily a technology that we talk a lot about, that people might know much about. I would say that the one misconception that I hear some of our research participants ask is whether I can read their mind as soon as we get them situated with the eye tracker. So they're very concerned that now I can read all of their thoughts, and we're certainly not there. We can tell what you remember in certain cases, or what your preferences may be, or how good your attention is, but I can't read your thoughts in a literal sense of knowing exactly what you are thinking moment to moment. Yeah, as far as I think just there's not great, I think there's just not a lot of sharing about what eye tracking is, what it is capable of, and how we might use it.
And can I get the next question?
Yeah, the next question is from David. David says, the Amish believe that some technologies are inherently harmful to communities and human well-being. How do you justify the claim that all technologies are value neutral?
I mean, there are, at least in law, but also in philosophy, many kinds of or many ways of approaching this question. And also, there are, if you approach it from a religious perspective, there are many ways of approaching this question. But as I said before, when I said this argument that technology is not good, bad, harmful, harmless, by itself is more about the use that we humans do with it. I always use the same example with my students. A hammer, in principle, is not a bad thing. It's something that you may use to do reparations at home and other kinds of stuff. If you use it to kill a person or to harm a person, then it's when the harm becomes a dangerous or bad tool.
And can I get the next question?
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, are there populations that are particularly vulnerable to privacy concerns with eye tracking?
I think that the populations that really need to use eye tracking as an accessibility feature may be the ones who are more likely to use the feature, and then maybe more vulnerable than to having their health information perhaps be scraped in a particular way. But otherwise, from my perspective, we are able to learn a lot about a person through their eye movements. So that doesn't necessarily mean that one group is more vulnerable than others, because of all of the information we can acquire about each person. So I would say it's whoever needs to use it the most in all facets of their daily life might be the most vulnerable.
I guess to dig into that a little more, Jen, if somebody is using eye tracking devices for accessibility reasons, is that data then governed through health data protection? Is that considered health data because they're using it in a sort of a health situation? Or are they just sort of ad hoc interacting with commercial entities who are providing a commercial service?
I think it could be, I mean, this is really beyond my realm, but I think it could be both. And maybe Natalia has better perspective on this, but I think it could be both, right? You're interacting with the health device, which, likely wouldn't be necessarily a privacy concern there. But also then if you are accustomed to those features and then are using it with other commercial devices and or need to use it with other commercial devices for their accessibility features that allow you to then engage in other content, then I think that would be more at risk there. But Natalia.
Yeah, no, I mean, at least from European Union law perspective, also in principle, the fact that you are using a certain accessibility feature might be, let's say, explicitly or implicitly revealing that you have a certain health condition, and that would be considered health data, which is also when I mentioned these three categories, non-personal, personal, and sensitive data. Health data, of course, it's also considered sensitive. So this sensitive data inside personal data.
And can we get the next question?
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, how cautious should scientists who are working in an academic capacity with eye tracking be when engaging in private company partnerships? For example, companies developing new eye trackers or cameras for gaming.
Natalia, do you want to go first from a more legal perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, in general, like not only with eye tracking, but I would say this could be a general statements. Academics should be very careful also. There is this, again, it goes beyond eye tracking, but this debate, at least at the European Union level, on, for instance, research centers being funded by big tech and them doing research on big tech regulation, platform governance, and so on and so forth. And then another thing or aspect that should be taken into account, which to me is the key point of the question, is when it comes to imbalances of power, when it's, let's say, equal relationship in terms of power, in terms of independence. In principle, there shouldn't be any problems. And actually, I think that researchers working with technology need to be in contact with the industry, because otherwise you are in this ivory tower where you have all these good ideas, but you don't experience the real world. But with caution, of course, being careful, particularly about these potential balances of power.
Yeah, and I think this is where scientists and academics having conversations with their research ethics boards is really important and necessary. Obviously, if you're doing research with participants, they will help you go through what is required in terms of data collection and data storage, and who has access to that data and who has ownership of that data, and making sure that your research participants are aware of all of that. And so there may be different tolerances depending on institutions or research ethics boards, depending on how the data are managed. But I think all of that has to have a very careful conversation.
I think also that that sort of potential collaborative relationship is maybe the only way to think about regulation in a different way. so that researchers actually understand what's happening on the inside of technology and are able to make the arguments that it's worthwhile to create technologies in responsible ways that can be used in responsible ways. Because otherwise, ultimately, companies are looking to make money for shareholders, and you don't have an ethical argument at the table. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question, somebody asks, what data protection legislation in Canada and or Ontario, if any, apply to eye tracking data?
I can feel this one. I think we have a couple. In Canada, we have PIPEDA or PIPEDA, which is the federal law that governs the way that corporations interact with their data. And then we also have at the provincial level, I forget the acronym, but it's the Health Information and Privacy Act, maybe perhaps HIPAA, or PHIPAA. And there's a federal HIPAA as well. So basically three levels of legislation around commercial use of data and the use of healthcare data. Curiously enough, though, in Canada, we don't have laws that really govern the way that government interacts with our personal information. There's sort of a de facto idea that government will always responsibly collect and safeguard and use our data.
Maybe if I can jump in and ask
Yeah.
a question. Evan, do you think these regulations are enough or already cover, let's say, in a good way, the uses of eye tracking that we have been discussing today, or do you think that another ad hoc regulation is needed?
I think they're all completely out of date and inadequate. I don't think there's less than something ad hoc, or more than something ad hoc. I think we need just a fundamental re-envisioning of how we address privacy. Similar to the way that Europe created the GDPR, which is now, what, 10 years old? Our privacy regulations are at least 20, 25 years old. And so we need a lot of rethinking about how to do this.
Thank you.
No problem. Ange, next question. And I'm so happy we have so many questions from the audience. We have almost as many questions as we do audience members.
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, what would a legal framework to check the use of eye tracking tech in unaudited field sites look like?
That would be work for regulators, but I would say one way, just because it's kind of recent also, in my mind would be the risk-based approach that we have in the European Union's AI Act. So maybe I envision different uses of eye tracking with different levels of risk, and then depending on those different obligations that providers should comply with. But there are, I mean, this is a question of regulatory theory, and I'm sure it won't be an easy one because also as eye tracking evolves, there is a risk that the regulation potentially might be get outdated very soon. For instance, in Europe, we have the GDPR that we mentioned already several times, has a technology neutral approach. So it's actually not targeted at any technology specifically. I think this has advantages and disadvantages.
Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question an attendee asks, is eye movement tracking used on children and in online schools, grade 1 to 12, for example? Is it legal in the EU, Canada, or other countries?
I mean, I can say that it would be legal in Canada because we have no laws around this at all.
I mean, in the European Union, we have several interesting examples, not exactly with eye tracking, but with different facial recognition softwares designed to track attendance particularly during the pandemic, to track levels of attention, performance during exams, and so on and so forth. Many of these uses were challenged before data protection authorities, and in general, these authorities consider these uses unlawful based on different, depending also on the specific software and the purpose used. But one of the reasons, or I would say the reason which was more common to all the cases, is actually the imbalance of power between students and school or school administrations. So as you might imagine, there is an imbalance of power in the sense that the students need to attend the school, or even the parents of the students are in a way forced that their children have an education, so they need it for their future, for their academic future, and so on and so forth. So there's actually a power imbalance there, which was the reason why in many cases students or the parents didn't even question this use. If the school says we need them and it's the way through to go through the pandemic, let's do it. And actually data protection authorities consider in all these cases that this was unlawful.
To provide a little more nuance to my broad generalization of the Canadian situation, I don't think we know enough of what's happening in Canada right now to be able to say whether it's lawful or not. And our kids are exposed to a lot of technology. As a parent with kids in the Toronto District School Board, I've had to sign consent forms that my kids are allowed to use, for instance, Google Classroom and other Google products. But I'm not given any detailed information about what that means. And so I'm actually currently in the middle of an appeals process. I filed an FOI, a Freedom of Information request, with the TDSB to get their contract with Google, and it was rejected. And so now I'm in the middle of an appeal to get the contract to find out exactly what it means to give consent that my kids are part of this educational apparatus. And is eye tracking part of that? When my daughter is using her Chromebook, is her Chromebook engaged in eye tracking? I have no idea. But hopefully I will know soon. And can we get the next question?
Yeah, the next question, an attendee says, are eye movements currently used in profiling various activities by law enforcement?
So there is exploration into whether eye movements can be used as a new kind of polygraph test. So whether, for instance, eye movements might be able to help an investigator determine what a witness may know, or to verify what a witness may know. So there are questions of whether it can be useful in those situations, including in situations where you think someone might be trying to conceal information. So you can imagine someone looking at a lineup, and you as the person or the witness looking at the lineup might not be wanting to identify someone in there, but perhaps your eye movements would tell the investigator who you do recognize within that lineup. So there are those explanations or explorations into the use of eye tracking in such law enforcement situations. Natalia, you might have a better lens on perhaps other activities that maybe are used that I wouldn't know as much about.
Yeah, not really, but I have, at least in the European Union, the intuition that they are not there yet. But also it might be, we saw this also with facial recognition, that usually this kind of pilot tests, let's say, beginning of research projects, there is no much information particularly publicly disclosed about this kind of uses of technology. So it's also difficult to know.
Which also means we may need to dig further.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have time for one more question. And can you give us that question?
Yeah. The last question would be, how quickly is this technology evolving? Public access of AI seemed to go from being non-existent to be widely pervasive overnight. Should we anticipate webcam, cell phone-based high-resolution technology any day now? Or is the pace currently still decades away?
I wouldn't say decades away. I think the speed at which you can see patents being filed is indicative of an acceleration of this kind of activity. Same with acquisitions of smaller eye tracking based startups. That has been increasing in pace over the last 10 years. Evan, what do you think from what you're seeing?
Yeah, I feel similarly. And that there's so much activity happening in the private sphere, but it's also disturbing that there's so little activity happening in the regulatory sphere. That the evidence is out there that this is happening. We're having this conversation today.
Right.
Hopefully there's somebody from a privacy regulator in on this call.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, you're going to wake up tomorrow and everything is going to be different, but I wouldn't say that we're necessarily 10 years out. I think it's a much closer horizon than that.
Yeah,
I think it's also,
yeah.
sorry,
Go
Natalia,
on.
it's important to understand this in context. We didn't get into the history of eye tracking, but this technology has been around for decades. It's been in development since what, Jennifer, like the 1940s or earlier?
Yeah, all throughout. Yeah. Even
And so we're a bit like AI, which is also goes back many, many decades. We're getting to the point where things develop much more quickly, where there is the ability to accelerate its development and its rollout. And so we could see something similar to AI, where for the general populace, it was not on their radar. And then suddenly ChatGPT came out and it was everywhere. It's not that it landed on from outer space. It was that these things were in development for generations, and eye tracking technology is similar.
Yeah, for
Sorry,
me,
Natalia.
yeah, a good example of this is, for instance, smart glasses. Like if we think the things that smart glasses were able to do, or the things that we were able to do with smart glasses a couple of years ago, and the things that, for instance, my students can do with smart glasses in exams nowadays, the technology has evolved a lot and very quickly. So yeah, I'm 100% on board with Jennifer. It's not a question of a decade for sure.
Thanks so much. We're going to wrap up. And so, Natalia and Jennifer, I'll ask each of you if you have any final things you'd like to say as part of this conversation.
No, for me, it would be just to echo what you said, Evan. I think the three of us discuss a lot about raising awareness about this technology, and I think today's webinar is like the perfect example for this. So thank you to this kind of initiatives, because I think they are very, very useful, and looking forward to keeping the conversation.
Yeah, I agree with Natalia. It's been fascinating to get out of my research lab and to hear about all of the other implications of the technology, and to hear about how other people are using it around the world. I think there's a lot of amazing promise to come, both in the healthcare space and in the entertainment space. And so I'm looking forward to those uses, but I'm excited to continue the conversation around governance and regulation. And as one final thing, I got a message that my background is mirrored the wrong way. So apologies to anyone who was distracted by that during the whole panel. So thank you for your patience there.
Thank you so much. And I will pass it back to Jim.
Sorry, my camera was slow in coming on. I really want to thank the three of you. I found this was really an engaging conversation, and you all brought such knowledge and expertise and perspective, and did so very effectively. And you could see that from the questions. we've done many events. I can't remember one where there's been so many questions from the audience. So I really want to thank the audience for their engagement in this. And so we really appreciate that. Now, I also want to say that tomorrow morning, or tomorrow in the morning, we're going to post a recording of tonight's panel discussion, along with some suggested readings or additional resources if you want to dig more into this. So if you enjoyed this, if you have colleagues or friends or people in your network who you think would like to watch a video of the panel you've just seen, that will be on our website and you can send the link to them. I also want to share our next event, which is going to continue the privacy theme, is going to be a week from tomorrow. So it's going to be on Wednesday, February 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And the title of it is, What is the Future of Voice and Privacy in the Age of AI? It's going to be moderated by James Parker, who's an associate professor of law at the Institute for International Law and Humanities at the University of Melbourne. And the panelists are going to be Joseph Turo, who's the Robert Louis Shaiton Professor of Media Systems and Industries Emeritus at the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. Stephen Neville, who's a graduate student in the Joint Program in Communications and Culture at York University and Toronto Metropolitan University. And Beth Semmel, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Princeton University. So if you're interested in pursuing another technology privacy-related panel, it'll be next week tomorrow at 7 p.m. You can get information about that panel and all our upcoming panels, as well as the videos of our past more than 100 panels over the last 10 years at our website, which is CFE, so for Center for Free Expression, cfe.torontomu.ca. And thank you again to the panel and to the audience for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone.